moving on to this year's trends. This year, and I'm also going to share this with you, when we did our research, we asked practitioners specifically about what they experience, where they at. And before I go into the trends this year, I want to share with you directly what donors told us this year and what the NGOs told us this year. We've given them a couple of scenarios, and the first question we ask both audiences is, what do you think is the biggest issue in society at the moment? The donors, the corporate sector, said to us, economic disparity and inequality. For the investment sector, they believe that is currently the biggest issue in the industry. The NGOs, on the other side, said education, skills development, employment creation, and youth unemployment. That is what they believe are the biggest issues. Now, the section in the middle is where both parties agree on currently the biggest issue. And government's incompetence and the impact of government's incompetence on the sector. Both are in agreement because that puts strain on donors to fund what government is not funding. It puts strain on NGOs to deliver services where government is not fulfilling its promise. We've asked them, in their opinion, what is the biggest issue currently for them? And for donors, that is to develop their own solutions, their own programs, obtain quality data for strategic decisions. NGOs' biggest issue at the moment is to find new sources of revenue, create their own income, determine their future value proposition. We asked them what is their biggest future issue. Donors are saying more impact with less resources, more effective programs and solutions to address systems change. And for NGOs, it is innovation. Innovation in new approaches, programs, better competencies, better skills, better capacity, better compensation of people working, better research for better data, for better management. We asked about the current constraints. Donors are saying inefficient organizational structures, inefficient due diligence, compliance, governance and reporting processes, and for NGOs, it's current funding models, increased competition, ineffective fundraising, imbalance in power relationships. Speaking to current challenges, donors are saying one of their biggest challenges at the moment is effective programs or programs that are properly designed, that will leverage resources to have high impact. Very important, and this is where you have to start interpreting the learning. So, if the biggest challenge for a corporate funder today is to get a good program, here's the problem. NGOs don't have the capacity to develop those programs. So can you see where there's structural issues here in the process which has a direct impact on the impact of our interventions? And then, of course, both agree that there's a lack of collaboration and scale. So where are the future opportunities for donors? More effective, efficient, transparent reporting and communication, collaboration. And for donors, for the NGO sector, to become better at branding, marketing, communication, and collaboration. But here's another very important underlying principle that I want to interpret for you and share with you. And I don't know if you've noticed this. When we ask donors a question, it's got more to do with a practice, the way they do grant making. When we ask NGOs the same question, it's very internally focused. And that's again a structural issue between the two. Why donors and NGOs are simply on different planets. Donors want to focus on the solution. NGOs just want to survive. And there's a problem in that, because how do we move practice? How do we then facilitate the change if the one's just trying to survive and the other one's trying to change the world? So I do want you to understand when we look and we ask for feedback, when we look at the feedback, what it actually tells us. That structurally between the investment sector and the development sector, there's major differences. So I'm going to move straight on to the trends. And I want to share with you the first issue. Speaking about these structural constraints between the investment and the development sector. I have tried last year to include at least all 400 listed companies in the research. Guess what? Most of the websites haven't been updated since 2013. So now I'm an NGO looking for funding. I'm looking at your focus areas. I want to send a proposal to you. I'm working with outdated information. The second issue is there's not a single contact on the donor sites. Why? Because they don't want to be overwhelmed. But who do I speak to? I'm looking at information that's 4 years old. But you're not even telling me. I understand you don't want to speak to 165,000 NGOs. Got it. But there's not even a communication channel. There's not even a form I can fill in to ask for more information. Let me share with you as well that none of the CSI divisions actually use their sustainability or integrated reports to share what they fund, where they fund, whom they funded, and what was the impact. Again, that is why NGOs overwhelm investors, because they don't put out the data. Not only that, the only way I can communicate with a funder is through a form. So I've got to invest my time to follow an investor's process on outdated information and then get a no. Can you see that where we are using technology, we're actually skewing the whole industry? And so this is what I mean by how bad is bad. Because we now wanted to automate the grant-making process, and I'm all for that, because we need efficiency. We know how admin-intensive grant-making is. But do you see the unintended negative consequences if the donor themselves don't follow due process? So, not only that, we looked at evidence, we looked at monitoring practice, we looked at evaluation practices. It is very bad. And here's my concern, that we are so focused on what the NGO sector is doing wrong, that we have not considered the impact of our own grant-making processes. And that is my message today. I just want to share with you that less than 10% of all social investors have ever conducted an external evaluation. So we're sitting here with an industry that is not sharing information, that's not providing guidance. And so where we're at the moment is not only a disconnect, but two sectors trying to do the same thing, making a difference in the country, but not speaking to each other. So where can we even start collaborating? That is trend number one. Trend number two is what I call the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good news is that we cannot get and let a crisis go to waste. So last year, we understood that grant makers are using this financial crisis to restructure portfolios. And the restructuring of these portfolios, because they've got less money, now led from an, on average, 5 investment portfolio structure to 3. But let me share with you the negative unintended consequences of that. The portfolios may have gotten less. We find on average that the number of portfolios have come down from 5 to 3. But the portfolios got bigger. So what companies are now doing is previously, for instance, just let's look at education. There was education, there was early childhood development, there was primary, there was tertiary, there were bursaries, there were all these other kind of things. But now they've just called it education, skills development, training, all of those kind of things now all of a sudden all are lumped together in education. So education got bigger, but it actually doesn't have any impact on the impact. Because when you have to assess, so what is the difference my educational portfolio have made? For instance, did it increase pass rates? What am I going to look at? Early childhood results? Bursaries? Skills development? Skills are not even aimed at students or the youth or children or learners. So can you understand the unintended consequences of trying to think, well, I've only got now so much money, I can only have 3 portfolios, so let's group them nicely together. The impact thereof on our impact assessment. The second issue, which is the not so good, is that grantmakers last year went into hiding. They just closed the office door. They didn't update the websites. They didn't answer emails or their phones. And how do I know this? Because no single funder last year responded to the Fees Must Fall campaign. I watched specifically. I turned every rock. And yet, the whole world has changed, but nothing has changed. Because if you didn't understand, if you are funded of education and you do not understand what happened with Fees Must Fall, you've missed the whole point. Because you can continue with science and maths funding. You can increase the pass rates. But when the students get to university, all that impact that you have built is destroyed in 1 year. So whether you increase the pass rates by 100% is null and void if they cannot complete university. So funders were completely absent in this discourse, this massive issue that befall South Africa in a period of 6 weeks. The third thing is, the more things change, the more they stay the same. My concern here, and you remember from last year's presentation where I focused on 2 portfolios specifically, health and education, is that nothing has changed. So the problem that we face here is we fund into a black hole. If we cannot change policy and practice and the system, education will continue to be all of our problems. So the problem here is that we fund in isolation. We do not understand the broader context, the broader industry in which we fund and how that has an impact on our funding. And taking education further. There were so many missed opportunities last year. Why do I say that? We continue to focus on science and maths. And I've told you the structural point that we hit, that when we have funded those kids, when we've educated those kids, when we've skilled those kids, when those kids have performed, and they get stuck at university because of the finances required for that, kids are get discouraged. So why should I go to the science class or the maths class or the computer literacy class? I'd rather leave school. So the dropouts last year escalated completely out of control. I can now tell you that for every 1 million children that start school every year, only 300,000 will actually get to grade 12. Here's the problem. It's not the 300,000 that's my problem. It's the fact that when we then do fund science and maths, can you see the small little difference we're trying to make? But we forget the 700,000. So there's no scale in any of our solutions. We're focusing on grades 10, 11, and 12. Why? Because we want to recruit from university. We want to get kids to university. But we focus on such a small, insignificant number that we miss the mass. So all funders are starting to move to that magic band, grade 10, 11, and 12, but ignoring the massive middle. So now what do you think is going to happen when a child drops out at grade 7? What happens if a child drops out before grade 10? Unemployment. So can you see we're not addressing a systemic issue here. We continue to choose where we want to focus on small numbers, on very sophisticated development models without understanding the big context. And this is what's happening in education. So you can continue to fund science and maths. You can continue to focus on an increased pass rate at grade 12. And you can hope that someone else will pick up your slack to get that kid through university so that you may be able to recruit such a person. What I'm saying is here, we need a whole new thinking around funding education. Why is that important? Because 80% of all corporates fund education. And yet, education is failing us all. The same is happening in the health portfolios. Why? Because we've moved away from very specific development models. Let me give you an example. HIV and AIDS was a big problem. So we had 80% of all corporate funders focusing on that. Guess what's happened? The moment PEPFAR left South Africa, the corporates did too. What we're starting to see here is that corporates funding in the health sector are going back to awareness around specific diseases. And that is, again, a structural problem. Let me give you the best precedented case study of last year. When 100 patients died, the Esimudeni case study. What happened? Government couldn't afford an additional 200 rand per patient. What happened? The NGO sector were unprepared for what was going to happen. Donors don't fund those kind of programs anymore. So the problem we face here is that we're focusing on issues which is starting to speak to our business. Let me give you an example. If you're a pharmacy, if you're a pharmaceutical company, if you're a medical aid company, what is your biggest business issue? Is payouts, right? So the funding has gone from very important health issues to prevention of illness because it affects those donors' bottom lines straight. There's a moral and ethical issue here as well. But what I'm sharing with you is that today we have more data than we've ever had before. But our fixation to focus on quantitative data, particularly in the health portfolio, where we're focusing on number of patients, number of the amount of HRVs that is being handed out. All of those things that focus on quantitative data, number of patients, number of medicine, number of clinics, number of doctors, has taken the eye away from structurally what is wrong with health and the failing healthcare system. And what corporates and investors are doing is focusing on where there's quantitative impact. So the lack of knowledge is leading to this portfolio's performance. What is also very interesting for me, and I've mentioned this before, is that social media has become actually a bigger driver for change than social investment or social development for that matter. Let me give you some examples. And I said I will come back to crowdfunding. I have watched crowdfunding now as a mechanism to raise funds extensively because I predicted the trend. So of course I wanted to know actually if the trend happened. So Candy Stick, now let's just talk about Candy Stick. I'm Afrikaans, so of course I watched Channel 147 or VIA. And Bobby and Caroline van Jaarsveld had a 13-week program where they focused on very specific social causes. At the end of every program, crowdfunding was part of that process. And so that was a beautiful case study for me to see how crowdfunding are actually working and if it's working. Within 1 week, 5 days, one charity raised 50,000 Rand. Now, I just want to take you back how far behind we are. Because 2 years ago, when I predicted crowdfunding as a trend, at that time already $118 million were raised for ASL. Now, can you see the difference, how far behind we are? 50,000 in 1 week versus a couple of $100 million. The second thing, social causes. Nobody in this country missed the Fees Must Fall campaign last year. Let me just share with you the power of social media. Within 4 weeks, government responded straight to the process and then came to the conclusion, okay, no increases this year, we're going to see what we can do. Can you see the power of social media to influence a specific course? And then lastly, what I'm saying is I'm starting to see specifically on Facebook in South Africa, the social cause movement and how they're raising not just funds, but goods needed for the NGO sector. So social media for both sectors have become a very important driver for change. One of the issues we picked up, and I referred to briefly earlier as well, is the changing roles and responsibilities. And my point here is that it's not a good thing. I've spoken about that both the development sector and the investment sector are saying the failure of government or the incompetence of government to deliver basic social services put a strain on both the funding and the development sector. And so this role confusion that we're seeing has got a much bigger impact. So what is happening? If you are a funder in a small rural town, you can actually not operate if government has failed to provide you with either waste removal, without water, without energy. So instead of now focusing on the basic needs of communities, what must a funder do in that town? Fulfill government's role. And we've allowed this to happen. I have spent the last 3 weeks specifically looking at the impact of SLP strategies. Now, I just want to give you a context. The mining sector cannot get a license until they commit to the DMR to actually have a social and labor plan for the next 5 years. Do you know what's happened with that? No more CSI from any mine, only SLP. What does that SLP mean? It means they focus on infrastructure. Do you understand why there's conflict between communities and the mining sector? Because the mining sector are building roads and bridges because their government is not doing it. So the incompetence of government does not only affect one of our biggest industries, the way we spend what we spend it on, but the negative unintended consequences on the communities. So now the communities are upset because they don't see the evidence of these social investments. But there is no evidence because they've been building bridges and schools and clinics. They've not been helping communities where it's needed the most. So that is just one case study to explain to you what is the impact of these changing roles and priorities. Now, I cannot speak about the impact of social media if I don't speak about the amazing work what I call these Europreneurs are doing. These are these people who follow these social media, who are able to actually raise the awareness of a cause and generate an audience of supporters around them to make a change. And guess what? They're having a bigger impact that donors with their proper grant-making process and systems have. They've got a bigger impact that NGOs whose job it is to focus on specific issues to change an environment. And here is what I do want to say. We're talking here about the next generation or the new generation of Zaki Ahmads, the David Greers of the world. We are talking here about the next generation of Kumi Naidus who focus and made us aware of environmental issues. Those are the people who are able, when they make a post on social media, raise R1 million within a week to focus on rhinos. That is what NGOs are missing out. They are resource constrained, but they don't understand how to leverage these new opportunities to raise awareness around a specific cause. Here's the thing though, and this is the point that I want to make, is that this next generation of social activists is able to use technology at no cost to rally support around a specific issue. They are fearless. They don't have grant-making criteria. They don't have to worry about upsetting the board about wrong programs. So I would have thought that good thinking, fast-thinking corporates would latch onto issues, especially if it's in their funding focus areas. And yet, corporate grant makers don't fund individuals. But here's 1 million people raising R1 million. You just need to attach your brand to it and support that process. But we're so risk adverse that we completely misunderstand this power of this new social media and this social activist. There is a note of caution. I don't want to say it's perfect, because one person very seldom changed the world because they're resource constrained. But here is what they're able to do. These individuals work outside of our industry sector. We've set up a sector to deal with issues like these. And here comes these young social activists, and they challenge our grant-making and development practices because we've built an administrative animal, an elephant, to deal with causes. And yet, on one single Facebook page, they are able to change the world. That brings me to the next phenomenon. Because grant makers, that's my premise, went into hiding last year, so focused on the little bit of money that they have and their focus areas, NGOs are just trying to survive and pay their staff, that there's a whole new sector that's coming to the fore, and I'm all for it. Because you see, communities have realized that they've got to look after themselves. And so what we're starting to see, let me give you a case study for this, a community on the west coast of South Africa. The West Coast Community Forum, they're called, have set up their own structure. They say, in Langebaan, we're going to look after ourselves. We're going to rally around ourselves. As citizens of Langebaan, we're going to make a difference. What are the needs? Who needs what? Who's got what? Let's sort this out. If we need money, we will raise money. Now, there's a whole story behind this. If you're an NGO operating in Langebaan and you don't have buy-in and support and you're not part of that process, guess what? You're out of Langebaan. So there is an impact here for the development sector that there's a new structure, there's a new animal, there's a new institution that's coming to the fore. And guess what? This is what corporates have wanted. Communities taking care, rallying around one single cause to take ownership and accountability for the work that is required. But here's a problem. Structurally, again, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Corporates don't fund cooperatives. Corporates don't fund other foundations. So structurally, we've painted ourselves in a corner again. So I'm saying again, the time has come for corporate donors, social investors, to change their thinking about how they go around grant making. Because if the whole world has changed, we cannot do the same things and expect different results. I do want to talk about the new focus areas that I've seen coming through last year in particular. For me, the big winner last year was food. I predict it will continue this year. Sustainable food and food security got massive funding. And guess what? That's where the international money went last year. It is in food security systems. It wasn't on science and maths. Okay? It was not on early childhood development. Food security was the one portfolio last year that changed fundamentally. It's no longer about corporates funding boreholes. Doesn't work. It's looking at a food security system for a community to ensure that they can look after themselves, and what's left, build a local economy around food. Amazing work is being done. I can tell you what happened from food gardens, people producing food, people selling that food, people actually providing the Johannesburg market with that food. They have formed a circular economy around food security. Amazing work being done. The biggest loser last year, unfortunately, was employment and job creation. In a time like this, I can tell you that our unemployment rate amongst youth in this country is not 25%. That is the total average for South Africa, and the figure government is publishing. Let me tell you, amongst youth, it's between 60 and 80%. And yet, that portfolio disappeared last year. I can tell you why, though. Because to create a single job will cost about R1 million. Why? Because we take so many things for granted. I've told you about the 700,000 children that leave school. What do you think it's going to take a child from grade 10 or grade 7 to give them a skill so that they can become employable? How long do you think that's going to take? How much money do you think it's going to take? Let me give you another example. All of you that focuses on skills development, 99% of all NGOs do not deliver accredited training, which means that training is worth nothing. Let me give you a third problem with this portfolio. If you don't have a job waiting at the end of skills development, it's an unsustainable portfolio. You have trained into a cloud. So, what I'm trying to say here, donors are realizing how difficult it is to create a job, to employ people, to provide them with a skill. Let me share with you another scary statistic. When we looked specifically at people, NGOs and funders working in that space, do you know when is the last time they've done research on their theory of change, their theory of practice, their program design, their program outcomes, their program objectives? On average, 10 years ago. So we're training. Here's the biggest problem. If you do have a job, employment, creation, skills, development, portfolio, we're still training for skills and jobs and positions which no longer even exist. So this portfolio, in my opinion, is why it lost the plot completely last year. And I instinctively know the reason why corporates don't want to fund that is because they know what I've just told you. It is difficult to make a change in this portfolio if you do not fundamentally understand that context. One of the biggest trends for me last year is a thing called a DAF. It's a donor advised fund. And it's almost similar to this whole new community foundation structure that we're seeing. Now, a donor advised fund is where I'm starting to see collaboration in the NGO sector. Let me give you an example. So, a whole group of NGOs, for instance, focusing on health, will come together and they will say, you focus on HIV, I'm going to focus on TB, I'm going to focus on prevention, I'm going to focus on awareness. That's our structure. You do what I don't do. What we're going to do is we're going to institutionalize this because we need efficiency. So what we're going to do is we're going to get a fundraiser for our portfolio. Because we don't have the people, we don't have the money, we don't even have the computers to do proper M&E and reporting. That person who's going to do our fundraising is going to do our management, is going to do our administration and our reporting. What I'm also starting to see is that those donor-advised funds are permutating even the investment sector. Let me give you an example. Mtombi Foundation. They're focusing on the SME sector. They say, we know you don't have the resources to do CSI properly. Give your money to us, we will find the programs, we will manage the programs, we will do the M&E, we will look after your money. So we will become your outsourced CSI division. Okay, so what I'm saying is, structurally, we're starting to see a complete different shift in the sector. That, of course, has an impact on the way we monitor and evaluate. And the biggest impact here for me last year was the impact of the SDGs. Let me explain to you why. Because for the first time with the SDGs, we're now starting, we've never done this before. Yes, we've done monitoring on how many boys was part of the program, how many girls was part of the program. But in the meantime, the practice have changed. We wanted to focus completely on the girl child. So here's what we've got to evaluate. So what happened to the equality of girl children, the empowerment of girl children? So the SDGs are bringing completely different frames of reference for us around how to monitor, evaluate, and assess. We've now got gender lenses. We want to measure inequality. We want to measure poverty. We want to measure gender equality. And that is what the SDGs brought to us last year. So from that perspective, again, I go back to the very first slide that I come from. What happens globally does affect us locally.